you might need to start streaming again to Twitch. Oh no, it's back.
There we go. We're back.
Okay.
Oh,
Not sure what happened there, but yeah, we'll blame the internet. Just the internet
We
in
love
general.
NBN.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm not quite sure where it cut out, but basically what we did was take a look at the decompiled main function of the app, and we can see that it's running the ID command. So this system function just runs basically like a terminal command of whatever you pass it, and it's calling ID.
Yeah, the set UID and set GID are... So even though something has a sticky bit, an app doesn't necessarily do anything with it. So you specifically have to set UID and GID to the user and group that you want to inherit from the sticky bit as well. So again, it's an old school programming thing. It's not something you really have to worry about today. But just because something has a sticky bit doesn't automatically make it exploitable.
Exactly.
Some modern apps, like it used to be that Vim and stuff like that, you could give the sticky bit, and then if someone ran it, I think they could just edit any file on the system. But these days, Vim, for example, explicitly just ignores if it's got a sticky bit.
Yes, it does.
So you can't like elevate or try and give most utilities a sticky bit because they just don't care. Anyway, continue.
Okay, so now that we know that it's basically just running the ID command, we try to figure out if there's a way that we can attack that. So when we run the ID command, it runs it from this user bin ID binary, which we don't have. If we just take a look at this, we don't have permission to write or modify this file directly, but the way that the terminal decides that we're going to run it from user bin is from the path variable. So if we echo out our path, it works left to right, so it's going to look in user local sbin, then user local bin, and so on until it finds the command that we're trying to run. And in this case, it looks, the first place it finds it is user bin. Lucky for us, we can edit the path, and there are places on the file system that we can also write files to. So we could use, our upload directory, or we could also just use temp, because we always have write permissions to temp. So what that means from here is we basically can replace ID with any command that we want. The way that I did it was, we noticed that in, hang on, this will be easier if I just redo it. Home John. So in John's directory, there's this password file, which we don't have access to at the moment. So pretty much all I did was cat home John password and dump that out to a file called ID. So now the idea is when this Toto binary runs ID, we're going to hijack it so that instead of running ID, it calls our cat command instead. And to do that, we just make temp our first item in the path. So the easiest way to do that is with export. So we export to our variable, which is path, and then the value that we want to give it. And we want it to have temp first, and then everything else we want to keep the current path variable, because what this will do is actually replace that, and we don't want to lose what's already there, because otherwise we won't have access to everything else that's in these directories, and we kind of want those. So now if we run ID, which ID? Oh, I know what I have to do. I also have to give it execute permissions. plus x temp ID. So because it doesn't have execute permissions, it won't show up. Which ID? There we go. So now when we look at what happens when we run the ID command, it's going to go to temp and then use ID. So if we run that now as www.data, it still does the wrong thing. Okay. It's not supposed to do that.
It's not supposed to do that, TM.
Well, yeah, it's not. Anyway, we'll continue and see what happens. We head over to John, home John, and run Toto. Cool. So for whatever reason, it's still calling the ID that it's expecting to in the terminal, but when we run the app, it is going out to our temp one that we created, and it's catting the file like we told it to, which is weird because when I did this the first time, it actually popped up when I ran ID and said you don't have permission to read this file. Anyway, we'll move on. So basically what we've got here is that John's password is root123, which is something we probably could have brute forced, but we're not into that for easy CTFs. So the next steps from here, we noticed, or we saw that the box had SSH open, but looking at the config files for SSH while we're on the box, it doesn't need keys. You can use password auth for SSH. So what that means for us is we can just SSH straight in with John at the box and our password of root123, and now we're in as John. Now that we're John, we have access to read the user.txt, which I won't do, and also to access things like SSH and everything else, but we don't need that because we've already got his password. From here, we basically restart all of our enumeration again, but this time with stuff that John might have permission to see. So a common one is we can see his bash history has stuff in it. A lot of the time with CTFs, they will clean up the bash history so it's completely empty and it's only really got content in it if it's useful for the, part of the CTF game. So we take a look at that. And we do have tab order complete because it's SSH. Now, looking at this, we get a bunch of stuff about, doing SSH stuff. There's a few sudo things, so that gives us a hint that John might be a sudoer. There's a few things around, MySQL, the username and password in the terminal bash history. This is what we were talking about last week. And then we continue down. There's a bunch of stuff about, where is it down here? This file.py, which is a file that's in the user's home directory, and how it gets run with Python 3. So let's take a look at that. Looking at the file, it's completely empty at the moment. But if we look at looking at the permissions, it's not like anything fancy that we can do anything with as far as, being owned by root or a sticky bit or anything. So the next steps, because we saw sudo in a bunch of these, or even sudo-l, in a bunch of these commands, we can kind of assume that John has some sort of sudo permissions. So we run the same thing, root123, to try and figure out what John can run as sudo. And we can see here that instead of being able to run everything, which is what we had last week, John can only run this exact command as sudo or as root. So we can give that a go directly, but we know the file doesn't do anything. So the next steps are pretty easy from here. We basically just take a reverse shell that we've always used, or our bash shell upgrade that we always use for Python anyway, and just dump it in here. So file the py, set paste, dump that in. That's basically just going to spawn a bash shell. Quit out and run the same command again. And ta-da, now we are in a bash session as root.
Nice.
Easy. Now we can head over to the root directory and see if there's a flag for this one. And there is, which we have permissions now to read and write. So yeah, that's kind of this box. It's fairly straightforward. It's very similar to last week with a couple of extra steps for the privesc, but overall it's actually very similar.
Nice.
Very nice.
Sorry, I was letting you just run it out there, but no, that's it's interesting, these boxes. Like, it actually kind of good that like last week was very straightforward. Like, it was, I think once you had like execution on the box, it was root was just sudo -i.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's good to start seeing some of those intermediary steps. In the real world, the intermediary steps are either more complex or just don't need to happen. Like, it all depends on your goal. And I think if your goal is to like exfil data from a company, you might not even need to ever pop root on a server. Running as the app user will give you enough sideways access to try and get further into the network. But
yeah, exactly.
Either that or the permissions will just be outright so bad. Like, you'll just be like, oh, just run us root. Oh, I'm root.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, so that's kind of it for this week. Hopefully next week we'll have something a little bit more difficult. We're just kind of slowly moving more and more up the ladder of difficulty as we see them in Vulnhub, and taking recommendations for boxes and stuff to do next, and just going from there. That's kind of the plan at the moment. We've got a couple on the go in the background, and we'll see which ones kind of look like they're going to be a step up in difficulty again for next week.
Yeah, all good. Sorry we seem to be petering out a bit this evening. I think we're all a bit tired.
It was more just not being really prepared. Like, I wasn't prepared to stream.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that I said I was up for it, and then I proceeded to do a different box. Anyway,
it's all good.
During our prep. So next week will probably be me. We'll be more organized. We also shifted our time around and stuff like that, which
didn't help.
led to some extra disorganization. So thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Yep, thanks for
Have a
watching.
good one.
We'll see you next week.
Stay safe. All the good things. Bye.
Bye.